Henry VIII's problem. Over in England, the King of England was delighted to hear about Martin Luther's new ideas. Before you can understand why the English king was so happy about the 95 Theses, you have to think for a moment about the history we've already read. When the princes in the Tower disappeared, their Uncle Richard became the King of England. But then Henry Tudor marched into England, killed Richard, and took the throne anyway. In 1485, he became Henry VII, King of England. Henry VII had already fought a war to get England's throne. He didn't want another war to start after he died. He wanted to make sure that his son and his grandson and his great-grandson would all inherit the crown after him, peacefully and without any arguments. So when his oldest son, Arthur, was only 2, Henry VII arranged for him to get married to the 3-year-old daughter of the King of Spain. The two even had a wedding ceremony, with grown-ups standing in for them, since the groom fell asleep and the bride was busy chewing on the hem of her dress. This was called a proxy wedding. It meant that the two had to get married as soon as they were old enough. When Arthur was 15 and Catherine was 16, the prince and the princess had a real wedding. The young princess let down her hair, which came all the way to her feet, and danced with the prince. Everyone feasted and sang songs and hoped that the two would have children right away. Arthur and Catherine went away to live in a castle of their own, but only 6 months later, Arthur came down with a high fever and died. Now the heir to the throne was Arthur's little brother, Harry. Henry VII arranged for Catherine to get married again, this time to Harry. Because Catherine had been married to Harry's brother, they had to get special permission from the Pope to marry each other. When the Pope agreed to give this special permission, Harry and Catherine got engaged. But before the two could marry, Henry VII died. Harry became King Henry VIII at the age of 17. In the year 1509, 2 months later, he married Catherine. Now the two could have sons. The crown would pass peacefully on to a little boy who could become Henry IX. The years went by. Catherine had a baby daughter named Mary, but little Henry IX never appeared. Henry VIII grew more and more worried. A girl couldn't inherit his throne. He needed a son. When Catherine became too old to have any more children, Henry VIII was desperate. What would he do? He could only have a son now if he had another wife. He even picked out the wife he'd like to have, a beautiful young lady in waiting at the court, Anne Boleyn. But no one got divorced back in those days, so Henry VIII could only marry Anne if Catherine died, and Catherine was perfectly healthy. So Henry VIII thought of another solution. He had only been able to marry Catherine in the first place because the Pope gave him special permission to marry his dead brother's wife. If the Pope would only say that the special permission didn't count, he could act as though he and Catherine had never really been married. But the Pope put his foot down and refused to take his permission back. Henry and Catherine had been married for 18 years. It was too late for Henry to announce that he'd never really been Catherine's husband. Nothing Henry could say would change the Pope's mind. So when Henry VIII heard the new ideas of Martin Luther, he was delighted. After all, Martin Luther said that the Pope was wrong to allow indulgences. Henry was quick to agree. And then Henry announced that if the Pope was wrong about indulgences, he was just as likely to be wrong about Henry's marriage. As a matter of fact, the Pope might be wrong about all sorts of things. So Henry declared that English Christians no longer had to obey the Pope. Instead, they had to obey Henry, who was not only the King of England, but also the supreme head of the Church in England. As the supreme head of the Church in England, Henry VIII decided that he could declare his own marriage over. Naturally, the Pope was furious, but powerful English noblemen supported Henry. They didn't want to see another civil war over the English throne, and they were willing to say that Henry was the head of the English church if that would get Henry an heir to the throne. So Henry sent Catherine away and married Anne Boleyn. In order to get his way, he created a whole new church, the Church of England. From now on, the Church of England would be separate from the Catholic Church of Rome. Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII lived together happily, for a little while. Soon, Anne Boleyn had a baby, but her baby was a girl named Elizabeth. Now Henry had 2 daughters, but still no sons, so he hoped that Anne would have a baby boy. But when she didn't, Henry had her head chopped off. 2 weeks after Anne was beheaded, Henry married another girl, Jane Seymour. A year and a half later, Jane Seymour had a little boy named Edward. Henry finally had his son, but he no longer had a wife. Jane Seymour died not long after her baby was born. Henry VIII didn't mourn his wife for very long before he decided to get married again. He sent artists all around Europe to paint the pictures of the princesses he might marry. When he saw the picture of a beautiful German princess named Anne of Cleves, he pointed to it. "Bring me this woman," he said. "I'll marry her." Anne of Cleves arrived in England on a cold, gray winter day. Henry rushed out to meet her, but when he saw her, he realized that the painter had made her picture far too pretty. Anne was nothing like her portrait. "She looks like a horse," Henry exclaimed. But the wedding had already been planned. Henry was afraid that Anne's relatives would be angry with England if he didn't marry her, so he went through with the marriage. Afterwards, though, he announced that he would never live with her. Since he was the supreme head of the English Church, he could declare that his own marriage was over, and he did. Anne left Henry's castle very happily. After all, Henry VIII wasn't exactly a handsome prince anymore. He had gotten older, and he was extremely fat. 3 weeks later, Henry married a young girl named Catherine Howard. Would you like to guess what happened to Catherine Howard? Henry had her beheaded too. Less than a year later, Henry VIII got married for the last time. Now he was an old man and often sick. His new wife, Catherine Parr, was a good nurse. She took care of him when he was ill and watched over his 3 children. She was still alive when Henry VIII died. Today, Henry VIII is best remembered for his 6 wives, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. There's even a little verse to remind you what happened to each wife. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived.